The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, with 196 parties, has near universal membership and is the parent treaty of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol has been ratified by 192 of the UNFCCC parties. For the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, 37 states consisting of highly industrialized countries and countries undergoing the process of transition to a market economy have legally binding emission limitation and reduction commitments. In 2012, the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol in Doha, adopted an amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, which establishes the second commitment period under the protocol. The ultimate objective of both treaties is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system.
I hear, full commitment from all countries that they want an agreement in Paris. They realize the urgency of this. They realize that we've been working on this for a long time. Necessarily so, because this is the most profound transformation of the global economy that we have seen in recent times. So it's understandable that this is complex, but they also realize that there is urgency here to send a very strong signal to both technology development, to capital markets, to governments, to sub-national governments, to corporations, that we are at a turning point, and we have to embrace that turning point.
A pre-COP ministerial meeting will take place in the French capital in early November to further address the high-level political issues relating to the draft agreement.
The reaction here is that we went from a text that had too much in it to a text that had too little. And I think the very healthy reaction here is that the text is definitely concise and clear and has a very, very clear structure, but that it is a bare bones text, that it only has the minimum. And the very good feedback that everybody is expressing is that they don't want a minimum agreement. They want an agreement that actually has much more ambition. We had an opening scenario in which parties came into the room with a very different view of what they wanted and how they wanted to proceed, and put those different views on the table quite effectively. The contrast between the views was very, very evident, and then they proceeded to work with each other and to listen to each other to understand what was behind the needs of each of the proposals, and finally to come up with a completely different proposal in the end to any of the beginning ones, but that everybody feels actually very comfortable working with. So, very good example of effective negotiation. Timely, it takes a lot of time, but in the end, it's a good result.
The G20 heads of state will meet in Turkey in mid-November, followed by the head of state meeting of the Commonwealth in Malta just before the Paris summit opens. Meanwhile, a total of 146 countries, representing almost 87% of global greenhouse gas emissions, have submitted their intended national climate action plans to the United Nations. This means that so far, over 75% of all member countries to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change have responded. This includes all developed countries under the convention and 104 developing countries, or almost 70% of UNFCCC developing member states.
Overall, countries are making progress. They're making pledges that are contributing to mitigation efforts. But if they're to meet their own targets, they will need to step up those efforts. What we're seeing is that to meet the post-2020 targets, most countries will need to accelerate their decarbonisation efforts.
Are we even on your list of priorities?
In 1992, governments met in Rio de Janeiro and forged the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That agreement, still in force, bound governments to take action to avoid dangerous climate change, but did not specify what actions. Over the following 5 years, government wrangled over what each should do and what should be the role of developed countries versus poorer nations. Those years of arguments produced in 1997 the Kyoto Protocol. That pact required worldwide cuts in emissions of about 5%, compared with 1999 levels by 2012, and each developed country was allotted a target on emissions reductions. But developing countries, including China, South Korea, and Mexico, and other rapidly emerging economies were given no targets and allowed to increase their emissions at will. Legally, the protocol could not come into force until countries representing 55% of global emissions had ratified it. With the US, then the world's biggest emitter, on the outside, that was not going to happen. So for most of the following decade, the Kyoto Protocol remained in abeyance and global climate change negotiations ground to a near halt. Kyoto Protocol was a beautifully written, watertight, fully legally binding international treaty, a sub-treaty of the similarly binding UNFCCC, but it never met its objectives because it wasn't ratified by the US and not by Russia until it was too late. And none of the countries that failed to meet their commitment on the Kyoto Protocol have been sanctioned. The Copenhagen Agreement, on the other hand, was not fully adopted by the United Nations in 2009 because of the last-minute chaos at the conference, though it was ratified the following year in the form of the Cancun Agreement. For this reason, the Copenhagen Agreement was derided as a failure by green groups. But the targets agreed at Copenhagen in the form of a document signed by the world leaders still stand.
We're going to get a deal that will be beneficial to the climate because, before now, many scientists are skeptical. They just feel that climate change is a cycle, a geological cycle, and many politicians believe that story and they feel that do nothing is the option. But now, we are seeing those kind of things we've never seen before, in terms of storms, in terms of the fire outbreak and things like that. So the people are beginning to really believe that there is truly a climate change, even at the highest level. So I was quite impressed when Obama said, we'll go to Paris and we're going to do something positive. Why don't you want me to be positive?
All countries are starting from different circumstances, and we've seen a lot of progress. For example, in the US in recent years, we've perhaps seen a stagnation of the reductions in some countries where they've been having to where they're forced or want to phase out nuclear power in the wake of the Fukushima accident, and so this is an urgent issue, but it's also a long-term issue. We have to have a transformation of the economy over this century from where we are now, a very fossil-intensive growth model, to something that's near zero emissions in net terms by the end of the century. That's hard to imagine from where we start now, but we have to begin, and these commitments represent a very positive step forward.
Nations responsible for about 2/3 of global emissions have now come up with their targets, known in the United Nations as intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. But some countries, most notably India, have not yet done so, despite being asked to meet a deadline at the end of March. Nigeria is one of the countries yet to submit its contributions.
We will manage that. It will be difficult. We will certainly reach 2 degrees Celsius. Whether we can go even beyond that and go down to 1.5 degrees Celsius, for instance, as some island states, small island states are asking, remains to be seen. Even reaching the 2 degrees Celsius limit will be difficult, but the first steps have been promising. As you know, each country was supposed to, or is still supposed to produce its own contribution on a voluntary basis. What we call the INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions. It's a bit complicated language. Yeah. Let's say contribution, national contributions. And so far, we have 150 national contributions. Now, on the basis of what we have already, those 150 national contributions represent more or less 85% of worldwide gas emissions. On that basis, experts reckon that we'll be able to reduce the rise in temperatures to 2.7, 2.8, 2.9 degrees. It's still much above the limit we have set, but still it is better than what we had before. Before, the scenario was between 4 and 6 degrees. So we have made some progress, but clearly the commitments made so far are not sufficient. And we will have to review those commitments, to review those contributions. Now, what is encouraging is that now there is a general agreement on the necessity to come back on those agreements and to review them and to improve them. It was not the case a couple of months ago. Now everybody seems to agree with that. It will be necessary to review those contributions and to improve them. By the way, I'd like to mention, but you know that we're still waiting for Nigeria's contribution. Now, we perfectly understand Nigeria's situation. After the election, there were talks and discussions of forming a new government. I understand that now the list of ministers has been submitted to the Senate, and we understand that it takes time. But we hope, and we're quite convinced, that Nigeria's INDC contribution will be submitted very soon. The sooner, the better. And it might be very useful afterwards as a good example for other countries, because Nigeria is not a small country. So a lot of other countries will look at what Nigeria has committed to do and perhaps will emulate, will imitate what Nigeria will be doing.